We begin with this. It is not good. It has happened again in Atlanta. The death of another black man at the hands of a police officer.
I can't breathe. 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 I can't breathe.
It's not a stretch to say that the last few weeks have been tumultuous to say the least. Protests and riots have broken out across the country over the death of George Floyd. Or at least that's what a lot of people might think. The truth is, George Floyd wasn't the first victim. He wasn't the first death. Racism and violence, because of it, has existed in the United States and the world since the creation of man.
Nobody knows the trouble I've seen.
Colored people were an easy target for white Europeans as a people to take advantage of. They looked different from whites, they spoke different languages, and thus, the idea that they were inferior to whites grew. In 1492, as we all know, Christopher Columbus arrived in North America and committed horrific atrocities to the natives living peacefully there. They were forcefully removed from the land that they had inhabited for centuries, forced into slavery, and considered inferior to the Spanish invaders. This treatment of Native Americans would be similar to how other Europeans, and eventually Americans, treated African slaves. In 1619, the first slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, the first of millions of Africans that would be taken advantage of in the United States. African slave traders would sell slaves to the Europeans, who would bring them across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States for sale. Slaves would be packed with not much more than a couple feet of space for each slave on the ship. This passage from Africa across the ocean is known as the Middle Passage, and most slaves that were going on this voyage would die. Eventually, after decades of abuse, slaves in America began to look for freedom, and select white people started to agree with them. Northern states began to lean towards abolitionism, although the idea took some time to catch up in the North as well, but it took longer still in the South. Southern states want to stick with slavery as their economy completely depended on it. The release of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe greatly shed light on the horrors of slavery. The book depicted the ruthless beating of a slave through vivid and horrid imagery. Throughout this time, most white people saw slaves and people of color barely as human. Incapable of emotion or feeling, they believed they were simply objects for their profit. At the very best, they saw them as far inferior versions of them. This book changed some mindsets on this primitive and stupid ideology. The take on slavery became so prevalent in the United States politics and the country that it created a growing divide among the North and the South. This disagreement, along with a number of other factors that were essentially because of this, eventually caused the Civil War. At the same time in Europe, the horrible scramble for Africa was happening. European countries split up Africa like a pie and reaped the benefits. These partitions of Africa eventually became what different countries are now in Africa. And these splits weren't random. Europeans purposely split up the countries so that groups of Africans that hated each other were in the same country and those that were allied were split apart. By doing this, they were able to cause unrest so they could easily colonize. Europeans didn't enslave people in Africa directly, but they might as well have, as they robbed all the natural resources, made Africans work their menial work, and limited all African advancement by causing so much unrest that the only way for Africans to survive was to subject to the white people. The most horrific case of the scramble for Africa was King Leopold II of Belgium and the Congo. Leopold was a founder and the sole owner of the Congo Free State. In a private project undertaken on his own behalf, he used explorer Henry Morton Stanley to help him lay claim to the Congo, an area known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, the colonial nations of Europe authorized his claim by committing the Congo Free State to improving the lives of the native inhabitants. From the very beginning, Leopold ignored these conditions, and millions of Congolese inhabitants, including children, were mutilated and killed. He ran the Congo using the mercenary force publique for his personal enrichment. Failure to meet rubber collection quotas was punishable by death. Meanwhile, the Force Pro League were required to provide the hand of their victims as proof when they were shot and killed someone, as was believed they would otherwise use the munitions, imported from Europe at considerable cost, for hunting. As a consequence, the rubber quotas were in part paid off in chopped off hands of these Africans. He used great sums of money from the exploitation for public and private construction projects in Belgium during this period. He donated the private buildings to the state before his death. Leopold extracted a fortune from the Congo, initially by the collection of ivory, and after a rise in the price of rubber in the 1890s, by forced labor from the natives to harvest and process rubber. Under his regime, millions of Congolese people died, Modern estimates range from 1 million to 15 million, with the consensus growing around 10 million. Several historians argue against this figure due to the absence of reliable censuses, the enormous mortality of diseases such as smallpox or sleeping sickness, but the verdict is there. Leopold took absolute control of these Africans and had no regard for them at all. This taking advantage of that King Leopold did to the Africans was one that was shown across the continent by different Europeans.
Let's take it back to America, where slavery and the controversy surrounding it had boiled over in a war. The southern states seceded from the Union because they were mad that Lincoln, who ran on the platform that slavery must be curbed, was getting power. That's right, Lincoln, the great liberator, didn't even start with the agenda of freeing all slaves. He just wanted to stop the expansion of slavery into new territories, and the South got butthurt over that. So the Civil War happens. The North and South fight, countless people die, the numbers aren't agreed upon, and the North, after a hard-fought war, wins. What's next? What we think is reform happens. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution were thought to have fixed everything, and the southern states were only let back into the Union if they agreed to the amendments. But of course it didn't work. The era of Reconstruction showed progress, to be sure, but low-key, it was a failure. The 13th Amendment may have overtly outlawed slavery, but through practices like sharecropping, letting former slaves live on land and pay rent, but charging them so much for so much work that it was essentially a legal version of slavery, were widespread. The 14th and 15th Amendment worked hand in hand, granting the newly freed slaves and their progenies citizenship and the right to vote. But then, many obstacles were put in their place. Poll taxes, a paywall to cast their votes, literacy tests, an educational barrier to cast their votes, residency requirements, evidence that a black person had lived on and was a citizen of the United States for long enough to vote. Changes to voting laws and voter registration that prevented black people from casting their votes. Jim Crow laws, laws that enforced segregation and tried to establish the whole concept of separate but equal. And that's only the political stuff. Then you get to one of the most infamous domestic terrorist groups in the United States. One so infamous that their legacy lives on to this very day. The Ku Klux Klan. Beyond just poor spelling, these terrorists overtly persecuted and executed black people. At their peak, the KKK boasted numbers of nearly 4 million people. By 1870, the Klan had members in every southern state. Some of them were policemen. Some were lawmakers or affiliated with lawmaking. During the 1873 Colfax Massacre alone, over 100 black people were killed by the Klan. This, again, led to reform. The Force Act and Ku Klux Klan Act were signed into law. President Grant was hesitant about using the power he got from these laws, and while he did use them eventually, the damage was already done. The KKK had scared black people from voting their proper representatives into office, and the ones who were brave enough got murdered. By the time Grant started using his powers to bring order and democracy back to the South, it was already too late. The violence of the KKK had gotten the Jim Crow laws and the other political necessities through, and black people were no better off than before. Now, to be fair to the black community, they definitely had reached great heights during the time of Reconstruction, to the point where there was actually a place called Black Wall Street. But when Jim Crow launched, everything came crashing down. The case of Plessy v. Ferguson was monumental, in a very bad way. The Supreme Court of the United States recognized and allowed the concept of separate but equal. The Supreme Court itself legalized segregation on the grounds of it being actually equal. But everyone in that room had to know that the whole concept of separate but equal was a pipe dream. After all, How can you make equal to you something that you actively hate? Everything boils over in a dramatic way in the Tulsa race riots. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, yes, that Tulsa, Oklahoma, was the wealthiest black community in the States. On Memorial Day, 1921, white people and black people attacked each other at first over the alleged assault of a white woman by a black man. The white people crowded outside the building where he was being held, and the rumors of him being lynched reached his community. They rushed to the site to see if he was okay, and a fight broke out between the white people and the black people. Over the course of the next 2 days, white rioters flew through the streets, killing people, burning houses, and looting stores. At the end of it all, when the National Guard was finally able to get everything under control, approximately 150 people had died, more than 800 were injured, 10,000 black people were left homeless, and just about $32 million, adjusted for 2019, worth of property damages were incurred. The event was so unspeakable that the citizens of the area didn't even talk about it, and it wasn't well known countrywide until an investigation in 2001. Another case of alleged black-on-white violence was seen in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. While the story itself has never been overtly referred to as an autobiography, the events and characters within it seem to be based heavily on Lee's own childhood. Specifically, the character of Tom, the black man who was falsely accused of raping a white woman, seems to be based off either the Scottsboro Boys, who were accused of the same crime on negligible evidence, and Emmett Till, whose case was a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Speaking of which...
Then we get to Martin. MLK, the GOAT. When you think of great American leaders, MLK is usually discredited in both American education and just in life. Sure, he will be commended in Black History Month for his nonviolence, but his impact is never truly studied. Like most achievements from African Americans, white Americans will just throw his impact in leadership under the African American or Black categories. When you look at it more, it's obvious to tell that MLK is not one of the great American leaders. He was the best. And before I start talking about how great he was, I just want to mention, although his leadership was extraordinary and he was the leading figure to the civil rights movement, a lot like to discredit the work of other activists and the centuries of unrest that led to MLK and what he caused. Obviously, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, and Malcolm X are also well-known famous activists, but others that aren't as celebrated are Bayard Rustin, Ella Baker, and James Meredith. Just want to point that out. But Martin Luther King Jr.'s acts of civil disobedience were truly extraordinary. First, he joined thousands across Alabama in boycotting the bus service in 1955 after the infamous Rosa Parks incident. The boycott lasted 365 days, a full year, although it remained completely nonviolent. And although it remained completely nonviolent, the situation became so tense that King's house was bombed and he was arrested. That's right, King's actions were so powerful that the United States government essentially endorsed the bombing and incarceration of King. That alone shows the astronomical impact he had on both rallying the community around him and making a change. Pretty soon, all segregation was ended on all Montgomery buses. King's involvement with this movement is what catapulted him into one of the leading roles of the civil rights movement. King continued to protest as the civil rights movement gained more and more traction, but somehow still remained nonviolent, which isn't as recognized as it should be, King's ability to remain nonviolent. King and African Americans had been faced with heavy violence and persecution since arriving in America with 300 years prior. King's own house was attacked. He received a letter from the FBI that they wanted to kill him, and he was arrested several times. He protested completely peacefully, simply demonstrating for a much larger cause. And what was he met with? Violence. More and more violence. But King stayed nonviolent. He stuck to his core values, and by having a leader that is just that unwavering, the rest of the civil rights movement mostly followed suit. Truly amazing. King's most famous protest comes in his March on Washington in 1963. We all know the one. In coordination with Bayard Rustin, over 250,000 people attended the March on the Capitol, easily the largest gathering in D.C. to date. Here, MLK delivered his most famous I Have a Dream speech, which to date is easily regarded as one of the best speeches ever given.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Through years of protests, he got President Lyndon B. Johnson to eventually sign the Civil Rights Act into law. And it wasn't an easy task. He and his followers were constantly threatened by both officers of law and the common racists. But the part many forget is that people think King was done once the Civil Rights Act was passed. This is far from the truth. MLK was more active than ever, speaking about social injustices like poverty and the Vietnam War until his brutal assassination. It's likely his assassination was endorsed by the government, as they saw his radical ideas as dangerous. More likely, the government was just scared of what he had to say.
Speaking of the government, the crack epidemic. You all know the story. Just say no. The crack epidemic and the war on drugs was an idea to curb drug addiction and reduce its usage. And considering that drugs are a big part of the reason given for building the wall today, it's safe to say it didn't work. Not only that, the war on drugs was clearly biased against racial minorities, specifically black people. The infamous 100-to-1 sentencing ratio, which saw sentence times of black people significantly higher than white people due to financial situations in black communities, paired with more and stricter policing in black communities, led to people who are still serving time for a crime that isn't even worth locking them up over. Nearly 500,000 people are in jail for a drug-related offense, and there was such a big disparity in criminalization rates between white people and black people that Congress actually did something for once and passed the FSA, which changed the sentencing ratio from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. Now, that's still not good enough considering financial reasons behind buying crack over powdered cocaine, but it is something. And all of those charges were only possible because of the cops that made the arrests. And that brings us into modern times. There are countless victims of police brutality which seem to be unfairly aimed and discriminatory towards black people. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sean Bell, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and of course George Floyd are only some of the cases, and that too in recent memory. The oldest case I just mentioned is from 2006. That was 14 years ago. There's plenty of other cases from before and during that time period, but in just the past 14 years, I was able to mention 10 unnecessary and wrongful deaths of black people caused by the police. So, you see, it's not just about George Floyd. It's not just about his death. It's about the legacy of it.
That brings us full circle. We also want to mention the insane negative impact that racism has had, not on only African Americans, but white people too. By subjecting an entire continent to slavery and hampering their success for centuries, more harm is caused than imaginable. First, it depletes them of natural resources and manpower, as the most fit people were sold to slavery. Not much can be built or created with most of the able-bodied people stolen. African countries are then put behind other countries as they're not able to advance there, and they don't have the resources to begin with because they were all stolen. Additionally, think of all the advancement that could have been made in technology and medicine that these people weren't subjected to slavery from the day they were born. Several of those slaves could have found an invention before a white person ever could have, and they could have been the first next great scientists to cure a disease. But no, all those opportunities were robbed from the day they were born because of the color of their skin. The only people even able to go to school to obtain a proper education, to even have a possibility to advance their world for centuries, were just white people. We could have the cure to every disease ever made if black people weren't hampered from whites from the start.
Now, that's not to say that there aren't people out there who have been able to make it. There are plenty of insane achievements that black people get to claim as their own.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge.
NWA and its members being one of the most widely known and best-selling musical acts ever. Drake is the highest-selling artist of all time. Rap in general being the biggest music genre is an achievement, since rap, as a genre, is widely credited as a creation of a black guy named DJ Kool Herc. Not just rap either. R&B, soul, funk, jazz, swing, all of these were black creations. Beyonce is one of the most widely known artists ever. Her husband Jay-Z is in the same boat. Kanye, Tupac, James Brown, Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin, Michael Jackson, Prince, Kendrick Lamar, Chris Brown, Rihanna, Lil Wayne, some of the biggest artists ever are black. LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Kevin Durant, Kobe Bryant, these guys always get brought up when it comes to the question of greatest basketball players of all time. Usain Bolt is the biggest athlete in the world. Spike Lee, Samuel L. Jackson, Morgan Freeman, Will Smith, Michael B. Jordan, Denzel Washington, Forrest Whitaker, Jamie Foxx, these are the biggest names in movie entertainment. Oprah Winfrey is one of the biggest names in entertainment, period. And that's great. It is a fact that black people have soared to the very peak of fame, generosity, athletic achievement, wealth, and artistic quality. And it's even more impressive when you think about the fact that they did that with so many obstacles. But it's not enough to hold these people up on a pedestal. They have achieved a status that few can ever reach. So yes, black people have hit the heights of humanity, but nothing has been done to make the floor even for everybody.
To end the documentary, we want to show some of the greatest accomplishments of African Americans, not as a way to patronize them, but show that against all odds, not only were they able to succeed, but they were able to destroy everything.
When he was 5 years old, Michael Jordan nearly cut off his big toe with an axe. He is the definition of somebody so good at what they do that everybody recognizes. That's pretty rich.
From the courts in Wilmington, Chapel Hill, and Chicago to the owner's suite he occupies today, his life and example have inspired millions of Americans to strive to be like Mike.
If I quit this season, I still be the greatest. If I quit this season, I still be the greatest. My last book just went viral.
Listen to me carefully. He's being given a special package, and I don't want you to open it. Do not open it. Cameras are on you, so do not open until I tell you. All right, open your boxes. Open your boxes. 1, 2, 3.
Name Barack Hussein Obama, he became the 44th President of the United States. Up to 2 million people crowded into 2 freezing miles of the mall, turning a solemn ceremony into a national, a global celebration. Their new leader warned them, though, this is a nation in crisis, but he insisted America's decline is not inevitable.
Today, I say to you that the challenges we face are real. They are serious and they are many. They will not be met easily or in a short span of time. But know this, America, they will be met.